Your book and talk, Every Citizen a Statesman, The Dream of a Democratic Foreign Policy in the American Century, track the evolution of U.S. foreign policy discussion from public world affairs councils groups in the early 1900s to the restricted policymaking elite in the 1960s. Do you see any parallels between the decline in this dream of democratic foreign policy and the American dream?
I think the American dream's somewhat in the eye of the beholder, but the broad story I tell does track kind of the fracturing of the United States over the last century or so. Every Citizen a Statesman concludes with the Vietnam War and student protests, when the dream of the democratic foreign policy had turned into a nightmare. Since then, we've had polarization, a collapse in trust, you name it, we've had it. And so I think it's hard to find any kind of dream that the American people could agree on.
Your read-ahead article from 2021, Great Decisions, the Foreign Policy Association, and the Triumph of Elitism in the U.S. Foreign Policy Community, asks, how democratic could the foreign policy of the democratic superpower be? As American politics have become increasingly polarized, as you pointed out, how have public interest, awareness, and involvement in U.S. foreign policy evolved?
I think this is a question that needs an awful lot more research, especially from historians. My sense from the political science literature and so on, from elite queuing models and things, is that not a lot has changed since the 1960s and 1970s. If anything, the structures of foreign policy making have hardened, really. You think about the profusion of think tanks from the 1970s, all of them claiming to stand in for the public. That's where the debate is now, if there is a public debate on American foreign policy. Within the think tank world, you think about how docile Congress has been since the Vietnam era, failing to check the executive. I often think about the speech that Secretary of State Tony Blinken gave, his first speech as secretary. It had the title, A Foreign Policy for the American People, but there was no sense it came from them.
How has increased access to higher education impacted young adults' access to and investment in U.S. foreign policy? Do access to higher ed and instant news sharing decrease Americans' incurable apathetic view of world affairs in the eyes of policymakers and other observers?
No. So this was the great white hope, especially after World War II. During World War II, obviously, American servicemen and women go all over the world to fight in the war. They come back, they get to benefit from the GI Bill, run through higher education. And the hope of many, many people was that this would lead to, an educated public in foreign policy. It didn't transpire for many, many different reasons. And so I'm skeptical that there are kind of long-term effects of this. For information, except for a very, very short period in the kind of 1920s, Americans have always had access to an amazing amount of information about world affairs. The problem has been getting them to read it, and then what you do with it next. The people I write about in the book didn't believe, and I agree with them, that access to information really led to anything. The whole point of their movement was to embed information in discussion. So we would get around a table and talk about what we had learned from the mass media and so on. And that's the kind of thing that's lacking today, organized discussion about these problems.
Your 2015 article, Realism and Malarkey, Henry Kissinger, the State Department, and Domestic Consensus, poses that a public consensus for Kissinger's détente with the Soviet Union would have come from moralistic conceptions of the U.S. and the world. Is morality or something else the driving factor in public engagement with U.S. foreign policy today?
It's a great question. I don't think it drives engagement today, though it often does. We have a huge amount of research done in the last 15, 20 years about religion and U.S. foreign affairs. And certainly Kissinger was Secretary of State at the very end of a religious revival in the United States that had been driven almost exclusively by the Cold War. The idea that if you were fighting an atheistic foe in the Soviet Union, one of the best ways to counter that was through religion at home. And so there was a profusion of moral language about U.S. foreign policy after World War II and up to the 1970s. It's hard to generate that kind of response now. The religious landscape looks very different to how it did then. George W. Bush tried, but I don't think he really succeeded.